The police officer looked at Diane Whitmore, then at my Earl Grey tea steaming in the morning sun, then back at her red face, and said the 5 words that changed everything. "Ma'am, you're trespassing on his lake." But that wasn't even the beginning of Diane's nightmare. 3 minutes after those cops drove away laughing at her, I made one phone call that would put Emmy in control of every street in our neighborhood, including the one leading to her $800,000 McMansion. What Diane didn't know, what nobody knew, was that her perfect little kingdom was built on a 40-year-old lie, and I was about to become the most expensive mistake she'd ever make. If you've ever dealt with someone who thinks they own the world when they barely own their own problems, you know this feeling. Drop a comment about the wildest power trip you've witnessed, because Diane's about to make them all look like amateur hour. Let me paint you the picture of how this whole thing started. 2 months after my divorce was finalized, I was working from home as a software architect, drowning in deadlines, and desperately needing some mental space. My backyard has this gorgeous little private lake, nothing huge, maybe half an acre, and I figured the most harmless thing imaginable would be setting up a small camping tent by the water's edge, not to sleep overnight. Mind you, just a quiet sanctuary where I could read my fantasy novels and sip some Earl Grey without the constant ping of work notifications destroying my sanity. I'm talking about a basic 2-person tent, a folding camp chair, and a tiny portable stove, barely big enough to heat water for tea. Pure Zen meditation setup. Right? Wrong. Dead wrong. From his kitchen window across the way, my neighbor Tom Chen was watching the whole scene unfold. Tom's a retired engineer. Quiet guy who keeps to himself ever since the HOA controversy last year that nearly forced him to tear down his garden shed. He told me later he was thinking, "Poor guy. Just wants some peace and quiet. Diane's going to absolutely hate this." And boy, was he prophetic? Diane Whitmore, our HOA president, came marching across the perfectly manicured grass like she was leading a military assault on enemy territory. 52 years old. Immaculate gray bob that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. And the kind of rigid confidence that comes from believing you're always the smartest person in any room. She was wearing a pristine white polo shirt and matching tennis skirt at 9:30 in the morning. Because apparently Casual Tuesday demanded country club standards in her world. "You cannot camp on residential property," she announced before she even reached my peaceful little setup. Her voice carried that particular tone of authority that suggested questioning her was not just wrong, but morally offensive. I looked up from my copy of The Name of the Wind, genuinely confused by the hostility radiating from this woman I'd barely spoken to in the 8 months since buying my house. "It's my backyard. Diane. It's just a tent for reading." But Diane was already shifting into what I'd later learn was her signature full-scale Karen mode. "There are fire hazards, zoning violations, and..." She paused, and for just a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her face. Her voice got softer, almost human. "I've seen what happens when people don't follow established safety protocols. I've lost everything once because I didn't pay attention to details." That glimpse of actual humanity lasted approximately 3 seconds before she snapped back to aggressive prosecutor mode. She pointed at my tiny camp stove. The thing was barely big enough to heat a single cup of water, and declared with the gravity of someone announcing a nuclear threat, "There's an unauthorized heating apparatus with open flames within 50 feet of protected wetland area." Before I could even formulate a response to this absolutely ridiculous accusation, she had her phone out, fingers flying across the screen. "Yes. I need police for illegal camping with fire hazards and potential environmental damage to our protected lake area," she said into the phone, pacing back and forth like a prosecutor presenting her case to a jury. "The resident is being completely uncooperative and refuses to acknowledge community safety standards." I just sat there, teacup warming my hands, wondering if I'd accidentally wandered into some alternate reality where reading fantasy novels by a lake constituted a federal environmental crime. The whole situation was so surreal I almost started laughing. But something in Diane's expression told me she was dead serious about this nuclear response to my morning tea routine. 20 minutes later, in the same 2 police officers who had clearly dealt with Diane's dramatic emergencies before came walking up my driveway with expressions that screamed, "Not this again." They took one look at me sitting peacefully in my folding chair, Earl Grey steaming gently in the morning air, The Name of the Wind open on my lap, and I could literally see them fighting not to burst out laughing at the sheer absurdity of the situation. Officer Martinez, no relation to anyone in our neighborhood despite the common name, asked with barely contained amusement, "Sir, do you need assistance dismantling your prominent library?" His partner, Officer Thompson, actually chuckled out loud at that perfectly delivered line. They spent maybe 90 seconds confirming that yes, this was definitely my property. And yes, I absolutely had every legal right to sit in my own backyard drinking tea and reading books like some kind of dangerous literary criminal. As they walked back toward their patrol car, I heard Officer Thompson mutter to his partner, "Fourth, call this month from that address." Officer Martinez just shook his head and replied, "Some people have way too much time on their hands." Diane stood there with her hands planted firmly on her hips, watching them drive away while her face cycled through several shades of red. "You don't understand the bigger picture here," she called after their departing vehicle. "I'm protecting this entire community from liability issues." But I was starting to understand something else entirely. This wasn't really about my tent or my tiny camp stove or any imaginary environmental threats. This was about control. Pure and simple. Diane had built her entire identity around being the neighborhood authority figure, and my peaceful little reading spot somehow represented a challenge to her carefully constructed kingdom. The next morning brought a certified letter in my mailbox that made my blood pressure spike instantly. A fine for $500 for unauthorized structures affecting community aesthetics and potential safety violations. $500 for sitting in my own backyard with a book and a cup of tea. I stood there staring at that number, feeling something fundamental shift inside my chest. For 2 months since the divorce, I'd been trying to fly under the radar, avoid conflict, just get through each day without any unnecessary drama. But Diane had just made this intensely personal. I folded that letter carefully, walked back into my house, and said out loud to my empty kitchen, "All right, Diane, you want to play legal games? Game on." But that $500 fine was about to become the best investment I'd ever accidentally made. Later that evening, Tom Chen appeared at my back door carrying a casserole dish and wearing the expression of someone who'd been waiting years for this exact moment. "My wife made extra lasagna," he said. But we both knew that wasn't really why he was standing on my porch. We settled on my back deck with plates of surprisingly excellent lasagna, and Tom started sharing what I'd already begun to suspect about our neighborhood's power dynamics. "Diane forced the Henderson family to move last year over a fence dispute," he said quietly, glancing around like he was worried about surveillance equipment. 2 inches. Their fence was exactly 2 inches into what she claimed was common area. And she made their lives so miserable with legal threats and HOA violations that they finally just sold their house and left. Tom's voice got even quieter, almost conspiratorial. "The thing is, Blake, I've been doing some thinking about your lake situation. Diane's been requesting property surveys for the past 2 years. Very detailed surveys. And she's been particularly interested in lake frontage boundaries." He disappeared into his garage and returned carrying an aged manila envelope that looked like it had been sitting in storage for decades. "I was the original surveyor when this neighborhood was developed back in 1983, Tom explained, settling back into his chair. "I kept backup copies of all the original documents because, well, engineers like documentation. And there's something in here that Diane doesn't know about, something she's never seen." The way he said those words, with this mix of anticipation and mischief, I told me Tom had been planning this conversation for a very long time. "I can't be the one to use this information," he continued carefully. "Too much history between Diane and me after the shed controversy, but maybe you can." Inside that envelope were photocopies of the original 1983 subdivision documents, property surveys, and development agreements. Most of it looked like standard bureaucratic paperwork property lines. Utility easements. The usual suburban development stuff. But then Tom pointed to something that made me sit up straight in my chair. "Look at this section," he said, indicating a paragraph highlighted in faded yellow marker. "Your property doesn't just include the lake. According to the original subdivision agreement, you own a 40-foot easement that runs underneath Maple Heights Drive, the main access road for the entire neighborhood." I stared at those technical drawings and legal descriptions, my software architect brain starting to process the implications. "Wait," I said slowly. "Are you telling me I have legal rights under the road?" Tom's smile was the first genuine expression of joy I'd seen from him since moving to the neighborhood. Not just rights. Blake, according to this original agreement, the lake property owner maintains perpetual easement rights for access, utilities, and emergency services. And here's the interesting part. It specifically states that these rights remain in force regardless of subsequent development or road ownership changes. My mind started racing through possibilities I'd never even considered. Tom, who actually owns Maple Heights Drive now? That's where it gets really interesting. Tom replied, pulling out another set of documents. The city sold Maple Heights Drive to a private company called Emerald Properties LLC back in 2019. Most residents don't even know the road isn't public anymore. I spent the next hour poring over those documents while Tom explained the technical details of easement law and property rights. The more I understood, the more I realized that Diane's perfect little kingdom might have a significant structural vulnerability that she'd never even considered. Tom, this easement language about reasonable restrictions for property protection, what exactly does that mean? His engineer's precision kicked in as he walked me through the legal implications. Well, if someone was actively hostile to your property rights, if they were trying to use legal action to harm your ability to enjoy your easement benefits, you might have grounds to restrict access that threatens your property interests. That night, I stayed up until 2 a.m. researching property law, easement rights, and the specific legal precedents for protecting easement holder interests. What I discovered was that Diane's aggressive legal strategy against me might have just handed me the nuclear option in our little neighborhood war. The next evening brought an emergency HOA meeting that Diane had clearly orchestrated as her courtroom for delivering final judgment on my tent situation. The community center had been transformed into her personal tribunal, complete with a folding table arranged like a judicial bench and her collection of legal-looking binders spread out for maximum intimidation effect. The other board members, Janet Patterson, Robert Hayes, and 2 others whose names I'd never bothered learning, sat on either side of Diane looking distinctly uncomfortable with the theatrical intensity she'd brought to what should have been a simple neighborhood discussion. About 15 residents filled the folding chairs, most of them looking like they'd rather be literally anywhere else on a Thursday evening. Diane called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her wooden gavel. Yes, she'd actually bought a gavel for HOA meetings and announced like she was reading charges in criminal court. We're here tonight to address a serious pattern of violations that threatens our community standards and safety protocols. I presented my case as professionally as possible, explaining property rights, reasonable use of private land, and the fact that I'd harmed absolutely nobody with my peaceful reading setup. Every time I tried to make a point, Diane would interrupt with her gavel and increasingly dramatic declarations about community protection and safety standards. Mr. Morrison, your actions demonstrate a fundamental disrespect for the collective agreement that makes civilized neighborhood life possible, she proclaimed with the satisfaction of someone delivering a devastating closing argument. Then Janet Patterson, who usually went along with whatever Diane demanded, actually spoke up with obvious frustration. Diane, I think we need to seriously consider whether this response is proportionate to the actual issue. The man was reading a book in his own backyard. Diane's face flushed crimson, and for a moment, the careful mask of professional authority slipped completely. I will not allow this community to deteriorate into chaos like my previous neighborhood. She snapped with raw emotion, bleeding through her controlled facade. Do you understand what happens when people stop following established protocols? Property values crash, families lose their homes. I've lived through that nightmare once, and I will not let it happen again under my watch. The room went dead silent as we all processed this unexpected glimpse into whatever trauma was actually driving Diane's obsessive need for control. This wasn't really about my tent at all. This was about some disaster from her past that she was determined never to experience again, regardless of how many neighbors she had to destroy in the process. Without any meaningful discussion or consideration of alternative approaches, Diane rammed through what she grandly titled Community Protection Ordinance, 15B. No temporary outdoor structures within 100 feet of any water feature, without 30-day advance approval and architectural review board. Evaluation. The vote was 4-1, with only Tom voting against the measure. As Diane gavelled, the meeting closed with obvious triumph. She looked directly at me and said, I hope this experience teaches you the importance of following proper community procedures. Mr. Morrison. The message couldn't have been clearer. Conform to her authority, or face escalating legal consequences. After the meeting, as residents filed out shaking their heads and muttering complaints they were too intimidated to voice publicly, Tom lingered behind until the room was mostly empty. When he was sure nobody was listening, he approached me with an expression of grim determination. Blake, that ordinance she just passed, it's specifically designed to force you off your lake property, he said quietly. But there's something I didn't tell you earlier about those original documents. He paused, looking around to make absolutely sure we weren't being overheard. Pay special attention to the section about prior existing agreements and grandfathered usage rights. Diane thinks she controls everything in this neighborhood. But there might be something she doesn't know about. Something that could change everything. I drove home that night feeling like I'd just been railroaded by a kangaroo court designed specifically to crush any resistance to Diane's personal kingdom. But Tom's words kept echoing in my mind, along with a growing understanding of the legal weapons Diane was willing to use against anyone who challenged her authority. That night, I sat in my tent by the lake, staring at the calm water and wondering if I should just surrender, pay the fine, take down my peaceful little reading spot, and go back to being the quiet neighbor who didn't cause trouble. It would certainly be the easier path, the safer choice that avoided further conflict with someone who clearly had both the legal knowledge and the vindictive personality to make my life extremely difficult. But something Tom had said kept echoing in my mind. Diane thinks she controls everything in this neighborhood, but there might be something she doesn't know about. As I sat there in the darkness, I realized that Diane had made one critical miscalculation in her campaign to establish total dominance over my property rights. She'd assumed I would give up and comply like apparently everyone else had done when faced with her legal intimidation tactics. She had absolutely no idea that I'd just figured out how to legally shut down every street in our neighborhood, starting with the one that led directly to her front door. 3 minutes after those cops had driven away laughing at her ridiculous 911 call, I was about to make the phone call that would flip our entire power dynamic upside down. But first, I needed to understand exactly what weapons I had at my disposal. The next morning, I called Rebecca Kim, the property attorney who'd helped my friend navigate a boundary dispute. Rebecca, this is Blake Morrison, Tom referred me. I've discovered something that's either going to make me very powerful or land me in serious legal trouble. Rebecca was cautious until I started sending her Tom's documents. The silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she spoke with genuine excitement breaking through her professional reserve. Blake, these documents are extraordinary. If this easement language is legitimate and enforceable, you don't just have rights under that road. You have control. She was fully alert now, speaking with rapid-fire precision. If your property's easement predates current road ownership, and if the HOA's actions constitute interference with your easement rights, you might have grounds for easement enforcement. That could include restricting vehicular access across your easement until the interference stops. While Rebecca researched legal strategies, I noticed changes around the neighborhood that confirmed Tom's suspicions. Construction survey crews appeared more frequently. Expensive cars with out-of-state plates drove slowly through our streets, their occupants making phone calls and taking notes. Most telling, Diane was having hushed conversations with men in business suits who definitely weren't neighbors. Tom reported that Diane had been making frantic calls to Carson and Associates, an expensive litigation firm. More importantly, he'd overheard fragments about accelerating timelines and neutralizing resistance. That's when my phone rang with the call that changed everything. Mr. Morrison, this is David Park from Cascade Development Group. I understand you own the lake property on Maple Heights Drive. We've been trying to reach you, but perhaps a direct conversation would be more productive. 3 hours later, I sat across from David Park in an upscale coffee shop, listening to the most incredible business proposition I'd ever heard. Cascade had been planning a luxury eco-resort for 3 years, targeting 50 acres of pristine lakefront property behind our neighborhood. The challenge is access, David explained, spreading architectural renderings across our table. We need vehicular access for construction, utilities, operations, everything. Your easement under Maple Heights Drive is the only viable solution that meets environmental requirements. He paused before delivering the number that made my coffee cup tremble. We're prepared to offer you $3.2 million for permanent easement rights, plus guarantees that all current residents maintain access. The lakefront property is worth tens of millions once we have access. David confirmed. Your easement unlocks the entire project. We've been working with a local facilitator for 2 years, but direct negotiation seems more efficient. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. I believe you know our local facilitator. Miss, Diane Whitmore has been extremely helpful in identifying obstacles and developing community integration strategies. Every piece of Diane's behavior clicked into place with devastating clarity. The surveys, the legal action, to the emergency meetings, none of it was about community protection. It was about forcing me to sell cheaply so Diane could collect a massive commission. What exactly has Diane told you about my willingness to sell? David's expression shifted. Miss, Whitmore indicated you were experiencing financial difficulties following your divorce, and that appropriate legal pressure might encourage a reasonable sale price. I called Rebecca immediately. Rebecca, I need you to file that easement enforcement action now, and I need to know everything about Diane's financial arrangements with Cascade Development. Rebecca's investigation revealed that Diane stood to receive $650,000 commission from Cascade, plus an ongoing management contract for the completed resort. Meanwhile, Tom quietly installed recording equipment in my tent, because Diane was about to make some very interesting admissions. Thursday evening, Diane appeared at my lake with desperation mixed with barely controlled fury. She'd received word about Rebecca's legal filings. Blake, we need to discuss this before it gets completely out of hand, she began, trying to maintain authority despite obvious panic. Which situation? Diane? The part where you've been secretly working with developers to steal my property, or using HOA authority to commit fraud? Her face went white. You don't understand the bigger picture. This resort project could benefit everyone. Property values would increase dramatically. Everyone except the 15 families you plan to force out through necessary relocations. Right? Diane staggered backward. How could you possibly know about that? Because David Park has been honest about your comprehensive community integration strategy. Diane sank onto my spare chair, looking older and more fragile than ever. After the flooding in Sacramento destroyed my first house, I swore I'd never be financially vulnerable again. When Cascade approached me, it seemed perfect. Secure my retirement and help the community. She looked up with genuine tears. But I became the thing I feared most, someone who destroys communities to protect themselves. Why didn't you just approach me directly about selling? Because David's research showed divorced men in financial transition accept below-market offers when facing legal pressure. She admitted with obvious shame. I convinced myself that pressuring you was actually protection from a legal battle you couldn't afford. 2 days later, I presented David with a counter-proposal. $2.8 million for my easement, guaranteed permanent access for all homeowners, plus a $200,000 community benefit fund. And Miss Whitmore's commission? David asked. Diane forfeits her commission and resigns from the HOA immediately. Non-négociable. David agreed without hesitation, clearly relieved to move forward despite losing his facilitator. The community meeting was unlike anything our neighborhood had experienced. Tom facilitated open discussion where residents could voice concerns about development. When I explained that every family would maintain housing while benefiting from increased property values and local jobs, the relief was palpable. Several residents admitted they'd been terrified about losing their homes to unknown development pressure. 6 months later, our neighborhood transformation was remarkable. Tom's democratic leadership created an atmosphere where residents wanted to participate instead of hiding from enforcement actions. Resort construction provided local jobs. Property values increased substantially, and the community fund had helped 3 families avoid foreclosure. Diane surprised everyone by volunteering to manage the community garden, channeling her organizational skills into something beneficial. She'd started therapy to address trauma from losing her previous home, finally dealing with the fear that had driven her need for control. My tent remained by the lake, now with a plaque reading, Blake's Lake, where small acts of defiance lead to big changes. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Diane walks by and nods respectfully. She's learned the most important lesson. Real power isn't about controlling others, it's about knowing when not to use the power you have. The final deposit of 2.8 million was surreal. But real satisfaction came from watching our neighborhood transform from Diane's personal kingdom into an actual community where people looked out for each other. And that's how a $20 camping tent and Earl Grey tea became a $2.8 million lesson in property rights, community building, and the dangerous consequences of letting fear drive your need to control other people's lives. If this story taught you anything about standing up to people who think rules only apply to others, share your own victory story in the comments, because somewhere out there, another Blake is sitting by their lake, and another Diane is about to learn that even the smallest tent can topple the biggest empire when you know which legal buttons to push. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's justice that benefits everyone except the person who tried to destroy you in the first place. But here's what I learned that goes beyond the money, beyond the legal victories, beyond even the sweet satisfaction of watching a neighborhood bully get exactly what she deserved. The real lesson is about understanding your own worth and refusing to let fear-driven people diminish it. Diane spent years terrorizing neighbors because her trauma convinced her that control equaled safety. Most people just took the abuse because fighting back seemed impossible. The truth is, bullies like Diane count on your assumption that they know something you don't, that their confidence means they're legally untouchable. But here's the secret. They don't want you to discover. Most of their power is psychological theater. The moment you start researching, asking questions, demanding documentation, their entire facade begins crumbling. Tom's old documents were just paper until I understood what they meant. Diane's legal threats were just intimidation until I found an attorney who could see through them. David's development company was just another business deal until I realized I held the cards they desperately needed. Every time someone tries to use bureaucracy, legal threats, or institutional authority to steamroll over your rights, remember this story. Remember that the person screaming loudest about rules and procedures is often the one breaking them most flagrantly. Remember that the neighbor who calls 911 over your peaceful cup of tea might be hiding a six-figure conflict of interest. Most importantly, remember that sometimes the best thing you can do for an entire community is refuse to be the person who just goes along to get along. Your tent by the lake, your garden in the front yard. When your fence that's 2 inches over some imaginary line, these aren't just personal choices. They're tests of whether you live in a community or under a dictatorship. The next time someone tries to fine you, intimidate you, or force you off your own property using bureaucratic bullying, ask yourself one simple question. What would Blake do? The answer might just make you very wealthy, while saving your entire neighborhood from people who mistake authority for wisdom. And that, my friends, is how you turn a $500 fine into a $2.8 million victory that changes everything for everyone except the person who thought they could crush you. Because at the end of the day, the real power doesn't come from gavels or legal threats or fancy titles. It comes from knowing your rights, doing your homework, and never backing down when someone tries to steal what's rightfully yours.